the topic of social housing. But when I looked at the broad range of topics that would be discussed, I said, baka naman medyo offside. Because the topic of the letter seems to be global practice of architecture and how it is related probably to research or interdisciplinary research. And when I learned that most of the audience will be students, I know right away the concern of students is actually the practice of architecture. And if possible, being a global architect and practicing globally. So what I'll do is try to relate the issue of social housing to the practice of architecture and relate it to the global practice of architecture, and slowly weave it also within the context of the need for an interdisciplinary research for us to be able to come up with really good housing solutions. The book I co-authored with a landscape architect, Paulo Alcazaren. I'm sure most of you would know him. And an economist, being in Camila. He's the chief economist of an Australian consultancy firm in the Philippines. Of course, both Paulo and myself are architects. So we have an architect, two architects, a landscape architect, an environmental planner. I'm a planner, like most of our faculty members, and an economist. Right away you'll see that it's difficult to write a book on social housing if you look at it from the point of view only of architecture. That's why it was necessary to put on board an economist and the other disciplines related to architecture. Now, we know that, at least the older ones, that for the last few decades, the approach to social housing and informal housing is such that we try to develop the city into a city that we want. Now we call it a smart city. And how we do it is to move out, that's saying it politely, but to demolish the houses of informal settlers and move them away to the margins, to the peri-urban areas of the city, so that we can develop the city that we call a smart city. I don't want to discuss this in the context of the current neoliberal ideology, which is actually the basis of all of this happenings, but I want to focus more on what we like and what we understand as architects and planners. But you see, even before I wrote the book with Paulo and Bing, the projects that we were getting as planners and architects for housing were for areas outside of the city, far away. This project, as you can see, was a project that nobody wanted to take. Why? It was an unbuildable area. At that time, that was in San Mateo. Of course, San Mateo now is a well-developed community. Nobody would want to take the project. He said, we're going to build on that land. He said, we can build on that land. Because we're architects and we're planners. If you are familiar with North Triangle homes, North Triangle, where you have Trinoma, where you have Vertis now, that used to be a huge informal settlement. And even up to now, you still have a pocket of informal settlement area where they are having some conflict on how to move the people out so that Ayala can build what they're building in the area. This place is in Montalban, across the so-called Arab City. This is the place where the first informal settlers, where Trinoma is, were relocated. Okay? And it is in a hill area. At that time, they asked me to design and build this church, which is a huge church, 1,200. If you go to Google Earth, you'll see how big it is. In fact, some of the pilots that I talked to said, we use the church as a landmark when we fly over Manila. No? But you can see, this is how we approach solving our informal settlement issues. Move them out of the city to the margins so that we can develop so-called smart cities. Now, don't feel so bad about that. You know why? Decades ago, when I was a young architect, I was consultant at the UNDP in Colombo, Sri Lanka, where we had these recent bombings. Okay? At that time, they were doing the same thing. They were pushing people out of the city to the margins where they developed the so-called social housing or informal housing. The same is true in Bangkok. I was also a consultant in Bangkok for the UNDP and the UNIDO. They're doing the same thing during that time, pushing people away from the city so that we'll have a nice city. Okay? But a city for whom? When we talk of inclusive development, where's inclusiveness in that sense? Where, according to NSA, a fourth of the population are informal settlers. Some says it's about a third. If you push them out, then these are the sectors that are excluded in our development. Okay. There was a time in our college when housing as a thesis was not allowed. Why? Because they said, it's so easy. It's not worth being a thesis. Why should we make our students design housing if it's so simple? And I asked, if housing is so simple, how come from the time of the dictator Marcos up to now, we haven't solved the problem? Right? It's